Welcome back, Social 30. Everybody's looking at me like, what's he gonna say? This is Great Depression Part 3. And in Great Depression Part 3, we're gonna lean heavily on the actual online document now and see what our objectives are. We should understand the many causes of the Great Depression, including issues with classic liberalism. So again, maybe the issue is that it's based upon the assumption that mankind's rational, that self-interest will unlock some kind of sustainable growth, and that if there is a correction, that the correction will be temporary. But that assumption was wrong, because the correction that began in 1929 still existed in 1932, and therefore there was, during the election, a promise of a New Deal. We should be able to describe the transition from classic economic liberalism to modern economic liberalism in the US through FDR's New Deal. So today, in parts 1 and 2, we really focused on the US story, and we looked at the freedom through government that the New Deal provided. But we also need to look at this from the Canadian perspective. We need to study the Great Depression in Canada and understand related concepts like labor unrest and the growth of the CCF that becomes our NDP. So sometimes on the multiple choice test, you'll see Great Depression questions, but the actual location will be Canada. So it's great to know what happened in the States, but we still need to know what happened in Canada. And we need to see some contemporary similarities with the Great Depression. The idea that this isn't an isolated incident. Mankind is still irrational, exploitive, and subject to creating our own economic crisis. So, a summary of the evolution of liberalism is provided here for you. And we also have some notes about the stock market crash and the Great Depression. So I know you've read the textbook today in class, you've taken some notes from me in the video, but there's some additional notes that you can go back to, especially if you're still wondering about concepts like buying on the margin, still trying to figure out what that meant. We also have some notes that summarize how this was a challenge to liberalism itself, and how it's going to end up creating some change, including social change, in the United States. Then we have some notes about the responses to the Great Depression, including Herbert Hoover, who was president in the US in 1929. And Herbert Hoover believed again that the market would correct itself, poverty was a local concern, and he wanted to practice laissez-faire. Now, did he respond with some policies? Yes, he did. But he continued to try to force people to practice their own individualism, practice self-interest, right? So this led to the rise of suffering and the result of some radicalization. So I've created a source here that kind of communicates how frustrated some Americans were getting. So by the 1930s, by 1932, some Americans were beginning to be tempted into socialism and communism because of the amount of despair they were suffering under capitalism. So perhaps the New Deal saved America from even more socialism. So distracted by the illusion of the American dream, receiving the fleeting joy of our new shiny cars and radios, we have slumbered on the sidelines of a class war for far too long. Even in that first sentence, words like class war say, you know what, there's Marxist undertones here. So next week, when you're working from home, and I say, hey, let's do an A1. This could be one of the sources in the A1. And this is establishing somebody that is suggesting that liberalism's flawed, and we need to embrace non-liberalism. We need to go all the way to communism. We don't want to go from classic to modern liberalism. We need to go from classic to non-liberalism. We need to go all the way to communism. Because they're saying we are slumbering on the sidelines of a class war. That's class warfare. That's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat stuff. We have been hunted, labeled breads, and branded treasonous. But the fact remains that we are the only true voice representing those stuck on the wrong side of this urban jungle. See what I did there? Little shout out to Upton Sinclair. Tough crowd. The corporate puppet, former President Hoover. So it's creating context. When is this? This is after Hoover's no longer president, so FDR is already president. The corporate puppet, Hoover, refused to respond to the desperate cries of the many. Instead, he perpetuated the plundering by the profiteers. I wanted to try for an alliteration. Lots of P's there. With his stunning defeat at the polls and a new man in the White House, FDR, is now the time to celebrate. The Democrats are promising a new deal, but can the huddled masses of New York's tenements, and even worse, those living in Hoovervilles around America, those are like homeless shelters in places like Central Park, kind of similar to that homeless village that was off White Ave for the last few months before Edmonton closed it down. Trust that the Democrats have the actual courage beyond simple campaign rhetoric to address the generations-old problems that lie at the very foundation of this great nation. So it's in brackets saying probably not really great, namely deadly inequality and poverty. Although I am calling for an economic and social revolution, it pains me that I agree with the parting warnings of the Hoovervites as they prophesize that a power-hungry President FDR will ignore our essential system of checks and balances and instead use this economic and social crisis to usurp what little democracy we have. So one of the criticisms of FDR is that he ended up violating the checks and balances, and he overextended his power of the executive branch in the US. That he often ignored the wishes of Congress and just said, you know what, we're doing this. And this is saying, you know what, I'm a little worried that this guy is becoming a dictator. If he, in fact, intends to push his policies through an intimidated and divided Congress and Supreme Court, rebuilding America in the process, what guarantee do we have that this pseudo-autocratic nature will not spawn a new, greater threat to America? Many of you have asked me why I remain so vigilant, even suggesting that President FDR shares our concerns and will, in fact, be the solution we literally hunger for. While it is true that he does promise the right things, I fear, with nobody remaining to hold our new president accountable, we are vulnerable to the simple-minded lure and false surgery promises of political tyranny. To whose ends will America now serve? I disagree with our new president. We still have many reasons to fear. And this is, importantly, right at the beginning of FDR's presidency. FDR takes office in January of 33. This is during those 100 days. So the speaker in a socialist rally, it was me, right? I couldn't find an actual speech from a socialist rally, so I made one up. But the hypothetical speaker of the socialist rally, they haven't seen the long-term effects of the 100 days or the alphabet agencies yet. But he's saying, you know what, I don't trust this guy. I don't think he's going to provide enough socialism. But I do also think he might become a tyrant. And maybe that's an even bigger threat to our future. So we got some sources here. This is a source that shows bank failures in America. And this is why they needed to respond with the banking holiday. This is the victims of the Great Depression, some of that photography. And we got some notes for you on the Great Depression, including some of the key alphabet agencies. So I put in some like the TVA, the PWA, the CCC. So you asked me which ones do you need to know? I've kind of highlighted the key ones for you. So these are critics of the New Deal in the United States. This is how the right wing was critical, and this is how the left wing was critical. As we saw from that hypothetical quote from the socialist rally, the left wing is saying, you haven't gone far enough. Now, this isn't enough socialism. And the right wing is saying, this is way too much socialism. So he did have a lot of critics. We do have some videos that you can go back and watch if you are still confused. So this is a key one that will talk about the boom-bust of the New Deal. So if you're still a little confused about monetary fiscal policy, about Keynesian boom-bust cycle of economics, I would highly recommend looking at that. Just for additional sake, I included some of his speeches, FDR's speeches. He did these fireside chats so that he could speak directly to the American people, rather than hiding like some of our current politicians. Every day he would speak directly to the American people to try to calm them and provide leadership. Here's a thorough list of the alphabet agencies. And another way to see what's happening here is to look at it as the difference between negative and positive freedom. And this is something key for multiple choice. Is classic liberalism is, as we've talked about, freedom from. Modern liberalism is freedom through. So negative liberty is the absence of obstacles. One has negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. Positive liberty is the possibility of acting, or the fact of acting, in such a way as to take control of one's life. So the textbook in chapter 8 does a much better job than that quote does in describing the difference between freedom from and freedom through, and negative and positive freedom. And the idea of negative and positive freedom does come up on the multiple choice. So I would ask you to, when you're looking at chapter 8, hopefully not for the first time, but when you get through chapter 8 and you're looking at positive and negative freedoms, I'd ask you to look for the evolution of liberalism that we're seeing here. So we see this mentioned in the textbook on page 274 and 275. And it's another way to understand that, modern liberalism's positive freedom, it's freedom that we're getting through something. And classic liberalism is negative freedom. It's freedom from something. I want freedom from you doing this. I don't want to have you do something in my life. Freedom from government, right? I want freedom from persecution. Whereas modern liberalism is freedom of something. That modern liberalism is, you're giving me a freedom. I'm adding something positive. Classic liberalism is, I'm protecting from something that you could do that's bad, right? Keeping that thing away. So page 275, 276 talks about that, and they're quite clear about it. We have a summary of the difference between modern classical liberalism, including a quick summary of Keynesian economics here for you. So many would credit Keynes and FDR with creating the idea of a mixed economy, mixing individualism and collectivism. So there's some notes on monetary and fiscal policy to review if you're still confused. But we also have some visuals. So maybe next week when I say, hey, let's do an A1, this might be one of the sources I pick. So we need you to be able to unpack the source and say, what's the ideological perspective? I know it's got something to do with the New Deal. These are the American people. They're planting a new planned economic system. But over here they're talking about, the luxuries unknown to grandpa, comforts in the humblest home. Where did these apples come from? The old tree was a mighty good producer. The old tree was a free economic system. So if the New Deal cut down the old tree, which is a free economic system that provided all of these things, is the cartoonist saying that FDR is wrong and he shouldn't be planting a new tree? Yes, the cartoonist is saying that. So many people were critical of the New Deal and suggested that maybe destroying the old tree, which was capitalism, was too much. Here you have a cartoon that's critical of FDR because he is trying to take too much power. The executive branch has the power to enforce law, but they shouldn't have the power to interpret and make law. But FDR was trying to override the checks and balances in America and push lots of things through, and the Supreme Court was getting in his way. So FDR is trying to push through Social Security, child labor laws, and all of these things, and the Supreme Court is saying, no, you know what, it's our job to interpret the law, and FDR is saying, you know what, you need to get moving. But because the cartoonist has drawn these as modern cars, and drawn the Supreme Court as, an old guy sitting in a wagon pulled by oxen, I would say that the ideological perspective here is critical of the Supreme Court for being a little bit out of sync with reality, right? That the Supreme Court's being a little obsolete, and they do need to get out of the way because these things are essential. So we must be able to take sources based upon this content and break it down and find perspectives. So that's the last part of the American story. Now we got to look at the Canadian story. So I'm going to That's gonna be actually part 3, and we'll do a part 4 on Canada then.